So next with flowers, we're going to talk about pollination and fertilization. So pollen comes in all shapes and sizes, and on the bottom right corner here, that's kind of an inside of a pollen grain. And then that bottom left corner, I know many people have seen this, this is pollen from a conifer. I'm very lucky to not be allergic, so hopefully nobody out there is allergic. Okay, fertilization occurs when the sperm cells inside the pollen grain travel down the pollen tube and into the ovary where the ovules are contained. And then fertilization occurs when one of the sperm cells fuses with the egg inside of an ovule. Okay, here's another illustration of this. Here's our pollen tubes going down. We've got sperm nuclei going down to the egg nucleus, which then becomes a zygote, which then becomes a seed, and then becomes a seedling. And we'll get more into the zygotes and all of that next week. Okay, so self-pollination versus cross-pollination. Self-pollination occurs when pollen from a flower fertilizes that same flower or a flower on the same plant. And then cross-pollination happens when one flower fertilizes a flower on another plant. And so here's a list of some common self-pollinating and cross-pollinating crops. And the thing that's really unusual here is peach, because peach is in the rose family, and many of our fruit trees have to be cross-pollinated. And one of the reasons for cross-pollination is to keep the genes diverse, so there's less chance for mutations. Okay, so self versus cross-pollination. Of course, you've got to have cross-pollination when you've got dioecious plants. You've got separate male and female flowers. There may be something about the male or female or the two different flowers that are incompatible. They may not be near each other, so that's spatial separation. And then there's temporal separation. So perhaps, not all the flowers on one plant are available to pollinate the other flowers on that plant at the same time. Okay, so we've got wind-pollinated flowers and insect-pollinated flowers. So wind-pollinated flowers, those produce a large amount of pollen grains. They're very light and smooth. The flowers don't really have much of an appearance. They're usually called insignificant. They don't have any scent, but the stigmas are long, feathery, or adhesive, and the stamen are long and protrude above the petals. Insect-pollinated flowers produce just a small amount of pollen grains. The pollen are larger and heavier. They have hooks and barbs, so they can attach themselves to insects. The flowers are bright, scented, and with nectar. Stigma are often small, and the stamens are often within a corolla tube, so sometimes the flower has to come up with a way to attract that insect inside its flower. So again, here's wind-pollinated flowers. Because you've got no nectar, you've got no scent, you don't need to worry about attracting insects. Pollen is produced in a great quantities because a lot of it doesn't reach another flower. It's very light and smooth, so it can blow in the wind. And the anthers dangle out so it can release the pollen in the wind. The stigma hangs outside the flower to catch any drifting pollen that happens to be flying by. And then the stigma are also feathery or net-like, also to catch drifting pollen. Insect-pollinated flowers tend to be large and brightly colored. They're often sweetly scented, contain nectar. They produce a moderate amount of pollen, because there's a lot of energy that goes into producing pollen. And so if you've got an insect that's taking it to another flower, you don't need to produce a lot of pollen. It's often sticky and spiky, so it can stick to the insects. The anthers are firm inside the flower, so it can brush against the insect. The stigma are inside the flower, so the insect brushes against it, and the stigma has a sticky coating so the pollen will stick to it. So here are some wind pollinated flowers on the left here. This is what they tend to look like. And the bottom left corner here, that's the male flowers, catkins hanging, and female are that shorter, smaller, upright, cone-looking thing. So quite a bit different than insect pollinated. So sometimes with the wind pollinated flowers, you don't get everything fertilized. So here is an incomplete tipful to a long ear and an unusually long ear because there was a lack of pollen when the tip silks finally emerged. I'm sure you've seen this. And then this is due to drought stress. So that's the other thing you have to really consider. Sometimes the pollen may be available because the plant is under drought stress. The pollen is not unable to stick to the female portion of the flower. This happens a lot with tomatoes. You know, you've got to keep tomatoes consistently moist throughout the summer because if you don't have consistently moist plants, the pollen will not stick. Okay, so when you've got differently colored lines, it helps guide pollinators to the center of the flower and has a perfect landing platform for them. And there are some plants that are brightly colored with protruding parts so they can attract a certain type of pollinator, in this case, birds. And I know that most people don't need to be reminded, but of the 100 crop species that provide 90% of the world's food, over 70% are pollinated by bees. So we really need to be very careful about pesticides and other things that can stress out the bees when gardening.